1 week season.
OWS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes, Hilow here. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to jump into them streets and we're going to bring you along with me. What does that mean? We're going to jump into a DraftKings $5 DK Millie. We're going to take a look at my thought process throughout the draft. You're going to get a live behind the scenes sneak peek into the things that are going on in my head while I'm actually drafting a best ball roster. With that said, we are going to jump right in, baby. Let's share the screen. Let's go. This is actually take two of trying to get this done tonight, which is Tuesday, August 9th. I got halfway through the last draft and my computer decided it was time to restart and run some updates. So I'm actually going to throw that into a storyboard, which Best Ball Plus members over at OWS are going to have access to. Those storyboards are going to basically do the same thing that we're doing here, but in written form. You're going to take a look at a snapshot from each pick, round by round, and kind of get a snapshot and a little glimpse of what we're thinking about behind the scenes when we're doing these drafts. So we are actually going to be in here in these streets, jumping into a $5 DK Millie best ball draft. The reason you're seeing DK here is I've already maxed the BBM over on Underdog. There are many reasons that go into why I did that. The primary of which is I noticed very early in the draft window when I started drafting those BBMs that the field was pretty much taking a conservative approach and trying to manage variance, as opposed to when you're drafting in the early window. I wanted to accept and embrace as much variance as I possibly could. So I wanted to max that thing. It's a harder field over there, generally speaking, on Underdog. I wanted to max that thing as quickly as I could, basically, before camp opened. So I maxed that bad boy a couple weeks ago. Now I'm over here in DraftKings. It's a softer field, general tendencies. It's a softer field. So I wanted to save all of my DraftKings Millie entries until I was able to leverage I guess the variance and the unknowns that were associated with the camp battles, with preseason, with getting a little bit more pieces of information and leverage that stuff when I had access to a softer field. All that being said, we're going to jump into a DK Millie draft right here. And you're going to get a glimpse behind the scenes of what Hilow's thinking about on each of these picks. We're going to take a look at a lot of the theory stuff that we cover in the Best Ball Plus product over at 1 week season. If you're seeing this on YouTube, you don't know who I am. I am Hilow. I am the lead NFL DFS contributor at OWS, 1weekseason.com. Head on over to there. We are launching a best ball product this season. You will have access to that bad boy, all the theory that goes into it. I am primarily a game theory guy, heavy theoretical concepts, heavy theoretical approach. You'll be able to get a glimpse of all that theory, all the other contributors' contributions to the best ball product for the glowing price of $1 American US dollar. If you miss out on that, man, I got nothing else for you. So head on over to oneweekseason.com, sign up for the Best Ball Plus product for $1. You'll have access to a laundry list of items that are available over there, including, but not limited to, my top 300 rankings for both Underdog and DraftKings. Those are updated daily. So keeping up with the news, those are updated daily, basically at midnight Eastern each day. You'll have access to high level theoretical theory and some concepts that are largely being, I guess, not mistaken, not forgotten, but not being utilized by the field. What do I mean by that? Again, 1 week season is a DFS content providing platform. We are heavily rooted in the theory components. We are heavily rooted in utilizing things that, quite frankly, the field is not. So we're transferring those kind of ideologies, those theoretical components over to the best ball scene, and you'll get access to all that good stuff for $1. So head on over to oneweekseason.com, click on the Best Ball Plus product, and get started for just $1, baby. So this draft is off and running. We drew the 11th pick. There's a lot of that kind of goes into my mind right away, drawing at the back end of the draft here. primarily of which we'll talk about if it begins to be a factor for us. But there's some stuff that I like to do here now at the back end of drafts that I think the field is largely overlooking. So we'll see if that becomes a factor for us here. I'll go ahead and talk about it. Actually, we're gonna pull the reverse jinx. So this combination of Travis Kelce and Saquon Barkley, what I like to do in the early rounds is think about player combinations and player pairings that are likely to be lower owned than, I guess, than the standard going by ADP and what falls to you. This one in particular, Travis Kelce, and there it goes. But Travis Kelce and Saquon Barkley, even though Saquon Barkley has jumped from a middle of the third round pick to a middle of the second round pick, their ADPs of Travis Kelce and all of the players at the back end of the draft, for that matter, never really lined up fully. So what we're going to be able to do is get a lower owned player combinations. And I'm actually going to take this one step further and get a player combination that is highly unlikely to be utilized this early in draft season. And hopefully we will get a little bit of action with Saquon Barkley and DeAndre Swift. Again, players whose ADPs typically have not lined up to be able to get that early round combination. A lot of people are going to be watching this and be like, hey, man, you took Saquon Barkley at 11 overall. Well, yeah, I have him ranked rather highly versus the field. He's currently my RB4 overall. But beyond that, he is highly unlikely to be paired with DeAndre Swift in the draft window so far. Again, ADP is dynamic. ADP is fluid. So that could change as we get deeper and deeper into draft season. We could see Saquon Barkley and DeAndre Swift continue to inch up in ADP, and then they would both line up towards the end of the first round. So that 1-2 turn, that could be a factor. So what we risk by doing this is we risk bleeding value now if that transpires in the future. But we don't know that. That's an unknown. That's a variable. That's variance. I want to accept, again, as much variance as I can on individual rosters. I want to seek those early round pairings of players that just don't line up in ADP. So Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, the reason that I think that's okay to do now is those are both guys that have the upside this year to be the overall RB1. I wouldn't do that with like a Nick Chubb. I wouldn't necessarily do that with a Leonard Fournette. I do that with those particular people or those particular players specifically because they both have shots at being overall RB1. And I want that exposure to upside in a way that the field is not yet utilizing. So that was a long-winded description of kind of my thought process there at the 1-2 turn. My thought process, particularly with the back end of the first round and that 1-2 turn. I like Travis Kelce paired with Saquon Barkley. Again, the field is just not going to have that pairing very often. Again, on a site like DraftKings where you have exposure to the bonuses for 100 yards receiving, Travis Kelce gets a slight boost in a format like that. Obviously, it's not going to be as much of a boost as, say, a site like FFPC where you're getting tight end premium, you're getting 1.5 per reception for the tight ends. But again, a combination where it's highly unlikely to be heavily utilized by the field. All right. As we continue, got a shout out to Fonz87 here, who is an OWS member. Dig it, baby. Let's go. We're going to be battling him a lot here. He started with Jamar Chase and Mark Andrews. That's more of a common pairing, but I'm not gonna dog on that. Obviously Mark Andrews is a top 3 tight end at worst for us this year, and Jamar Chase, I currently have him at wide receiver 4. All right, so we're waiting patiently here for whoopsies, went a little too far. Waiting patiently here for our 3rd round pick. Currently, oh no. There we go. We're back, baby. Accidentally went back there. We're currently waiting patiently for our 3rd round pick. Again, we'll be picking at pick 35 overall, or 3.5 1.11. Another, or I guess some more interesting options that we can discuss here prior, but what am I thinking about right now? I can tell you what the field is thinking about, and we'll do that first. If the field were sitting, and again, this is general field tendencies that through observation and through, I guess, just knowing how ADP, I've drafted over 250 rosters at this point. So knowing how ADP lines up, knowing the different nuances of the different formats and the different scorings, what can we project the field to do through our observations through all those drafts? Well, we can project the field to be thinking about week 17 correlations because that's the hotness on the street right now. So looking at Saquon Barkley and DeAndre Swift, what are they likely thinking about? They're likely thinking about the Indianapolis Colts and the Chicago Bears for what we have right now, right? I can tell you I am not necessarily thinking about that this early. I am going to basically let the draft room kind of decide where this draft takes me through these first 6-7 rounds, the premier, the ultimate rounds where we're really worried about where this roster is going to develop. I can tell you what the field is also likely thinking about is they're likely thinking about, we have 2 running backs on this roster and not much else. Now they're thinking about, is this going to be a superhero running back roster? Is this going to be a robust running back roster? I say, don't worry about any of that stuff at this point. It's way too early to be wondering about what the ultimate, archetype of this roster is going to look like. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about kind of what the field is thinking about first and foremost, so I can then base my decisions around that and not basically just follow along in the echo chamber and draft similar to what the field is doing. So we have some decisions here. Currently have Travis Etienne, DJ Moore, Zeke, and Cortland Sutton still on the board, and they all make it to us. What do we think is likeliest to happen or to fall? How did he know? Let me check out your team real quick. Where you go, dude? All right, so he's 1-1, so we can't really glean too much information off of that. But I am going to make a stand here and take another upside running back in Travis Etienne. This is a guy who I personally have ranked at RB13, so right on the 1-2 borderline. But on a full PPR site like DraftKings is, I want that access to the additional floor that he provides on my roster. Why I did that, there's 2 wide receivers still on the board that I would be plenty fine taking as my wide receiver 1, and Terry McLaurin was not one of them, so he just went. So we are definitely going to get one of those guys. Those guys are DJ Moore that we talked about earlier. DJ Moore makes a lot of sense on this roster because we picked in the back half of the roster. So CMC is the guy I'm thinking about. He goes in the front half of the first round. So by taking DJ Moore here, we have increased exposure to the leverage associated with not selecting Christian McCaffrey. The other guy that I was talking about is Cortland Sutton. Definite shot at a wide receiver 1 season. And now that Tim Patrick is injured, I like his upside all the more. So we're going to add Cortland Sutton to this roster. Through 4 rounds, we've got Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, and Travis Etienne at running back. We have Cortland Sutton at wide receiver. Again, the field is probably looking at this roster at this point thinking, okay, I'm probably going somewhat robust running back. I'm not thinking about that just yet. We're going to see where this draft takes us, and I'm not putting any labels on what is going on. I could stop it through running backs. I'm crazy. You know me. For those not familiar, for those seeing this for the first time, not knowing who I am, who Hilow is, what is going on, there is a lot of theory that goes associated with these drafts. If you are not familiar, go check out the 1 Week Season podcast. It's available on all of your major podcast providers. Just search 1 Week Season. You'll pull up our primary thread. On that, I am through 8 podcasts that explain the heavy theoretical aspects of why stopping at 3 running backs is a viable option if you've selected 3 in the first 4 rounds. So I'm not going to get into that here. Again, this is going up on YouTube. You're watching this now on that platform. If you haven't yet checked out 1 Week Seasons podcast, go over there, subscribe to that bad boy. Podcasts launch every Friday at between 7 and 9 a.m. And we cover all the heavy hitting theoretical components behind why I said that is a viable strategy here. All righty then. Let's take a look at kind of the pick history, what has been going on. So our boy Fonz followed up with Kyle Pitts and Zeke. So he's putting together a nice roster over there as well. But behind us, immediately Jalen Waddle went and DJ Moore went. We talked about kind of what my decision point would have been there. It was between DJ Moore and Courtland Sutton. I talked about why the theoretical components were weighing a little bit in the favor of DJ Moore. But now when we start talking about like dynamic ADP, how fluid it is with the news of Tim Patrick's basically season-ending injury, we could see Courtland Sutton start to sneak up these draft boards. So that's why I liked him there in the 4th. That's why also I took Travis Etienne, because I knew I wanted one of those wide receivers coming back, and I would have been fine with either of them. Having to choose between the two was a little bit more nuanced, but we made our decision and we are pressing forward. Oh man, there's a lot of interim talking that has to go on when you're picking at the end here. So I'm going to try and keep it up. The landscape of the room. That's something that you want to be paying attention to, what different teams are selecting and how they're going about their drafts. So we look at this pick history. There's no real glaring reaches at this point. Juju in the middle to late 4th might be considered a reach here from U2 Easy. Let's take a look at his roster. Pittman there, Kamara. Yeah, so there's really not anything glaring from a draft room perspective. We got Tug MC getting some nice value with Lamar Jackson in the 5th and Darren Waller at the 4-5 turn. Something interesting that I want to talk about specifically with that 4-5 turn, and specifically what Tug MC did. There is definite upside to be had for a non-standard correlation there, specifically with Lamar Jackson and Deontay Johnson. The reason I say that is what you're probably going to see at that 4-5 turn the most with teams that take Lamar Jackson is you're probably going to see a Rashad Bateman pairing. If you get that week 17 correlation through Lamar Jackson and Deontay Johnson, you're getting access to the primary contributors of both those offenses, and you're doing it in a way that the field is highly unlikely to do. All right, decision here. Cam Akers would be an option, but with us starting 3 out of 4 running backs, he kind of falls down the line there. So we're really looking at quarterback, wide receiver, and tight end. Quarterbacks, there is definite merit to waiting on Kyler Murray to see if he comes back to us. This is an interesting one as well, because what we can do is highly likely for Kyler to make it back to us. So that bumps Marquise Brown, Hollywood Brown, up a little bit in this decision. Basically, it would be down for me between Brown, Metcalf, and Thielen here. So we're going to go ahead with Brown and look to get the starting of a primary correlation. The reason I like the Cardinals is their Week 17 opponent, Atlanta, is a team that is very haves or have-nots from the perspective of the field. They are highly likely to, if they're working on primary correlations, it's like Kyler Murray, Marquise Brown, and Nuke, and then looking for either Pitts or Drake London. So you have a lot more, I guess, freedoms to build those primary correlations with a guy like Cordero Patterson, with a guy like Brian Edwards, with guys that are basically could be a massive portion of the game plan in week 17 for an expected shootout type game that are just not being drafted that way from the field. So Nuke goes here, interestingly enough, when we still have DK Metcalf and Darnell Mooney and Adam Thielen here on the board. But what we're going to do is we're going to fulfill that primary correlation and get the upside at the quarterback position to pair with our wide receiver 2, which is high upside. My draft juice. Got to have the draft juice. I want to see this how did I know guy. Because that was the first pick where it was this DeAndre Hopkins pick was and Josh Jacobs DeAndre Hopkins pick at the 5-6 turn was the first real head scratcher that I've seen from this draft. So with him picking between our 2 picks, that is something that I kind of want to take a closer look at. So he's got Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, and Josh Jacobs at running back, and then Stephon Diggs, Terry McLaurin. That was a head scratcher too that I noticed, but it wasn't enough for me to really dig into this guy, how he's drafting when it happened. And that Terry McLaurin pick, you heard me say, like, I have 2 wide receivers that I'm looking for in DJ Moore and Cortland Sutton. And then I saw Terry McLaurin go, and I said that was not one of them. But so that was the first indication. But now that he takes Josh Jacobs and DeAndre Hopkins well above ADP, picking in between us, that is something to note. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about reading the room and just kind of getting an eye on the overall tendencies of the room. That is something to take note of. So that's something that we can use in the future as we're drafting with this guy at the turn in between our 2 picks. So that is definitely something to note. A guy who is reaching for players that are not on my radar, which is a good thing. Not on my radar for particularly where they're going at ADP. We'll throw in that caveat. So that is a good to know. Very nice. So our roster here through 6 rounds. We have Kyler Murray, Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, and Travis Etienne. And we've got Cortland Sutton and Marquise Brown, who are both high spike week potential wide receivers. That doesn't necessarily, when I'm talking about high spike week potential wide receivers, I'm not necessarily speaking from a strict floor and ceiling sense. I'm talking about wide receivers with a wider range of outcomes. Why is wider range of outcomes important to us from a best ball perspective? Well, I want the potential to get these like world beating single week scores. Highly valuable to us in a format like best ball where the computer is selecting our optimal roster for us. So I'm not worried about like, oh, my wide receiver 1, my wide receiver 2, my wide receiver 3, certain like floor ceiling archetypes from those players. No, I'm thinking about how my roster comes together as a whole. And I kind of am okay personally with these wide range of outcomes all coming together. I'm less worried about I have 3 floor wide receivers and I have 5, 6 upside wide receivers. No, I'm just worried about the overall composition of my roster as a whole and accepting as much variance as I'm personally willing to accept a lot more variance than I think the field is on individual rosters. All right, so we're coming up on our 7th round pick, picking at the 7-11, baby. We have some more interesting options available to us right here with Russell Wilson. We have Russell Wilson, who we could pair with our primary wide receiver that we've already selected on this roster. Right at ADP, I'm not too worried about that as far as leverage and all that stuff goes, because this is still very early in the draft. And we've already built in a significant amount of leverage with our first 2 draft choices there. Can get some massive upside at wide receiver and continue that. We also have some solid running back selections available to us with Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Chase Edmonds in particular, who are still not going, I think, where they should be going, but they have come up in ADP a good deal. Again, with this wild card behind us, I think it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and keep pounding these correlations. So we'll see if Russell Wilson makes it to us here. If he does, best available correlations, you can't really beat that here in the 7th round. So we are going to jump all over that. Also, with Tim Patrick going down, we have a more condensed offense in Denver, passing offense that is, and there's still some pass catchers that are going after Russ that we can build onto that primary stack as well. We'll see what this wild card does here at the turn, but we do have some options available to us as well still. So he goes tight end with TJ Hawkinson. This is what I would consider a tight end dead zone. I'm either going to be shooting for one of the top 6 tight ends, that tier, that couple of tiers pretty much ending with Dalton Schultz. And those are the guys who I think have a legitimate path to being the overall tight end 1 this season. After that, I'm pretty much a wait kind of guy. It's just what I'm looking to do. So we have some options available to us. As I said, Damian Harris would not fit on this roster. The reasons being he's more of a floor running back. He's more of a 0 running back target. He's more of a guy that you would want as your RB1 or RB2 because you can fill an upside elsewhere on your roster. On this roster, we already have 3 upside running backs with built-in floor. So we're going to shoot at some wide receiver upside here with Kadarius Toney. The reason why I like Kadarius Toney, besides his archetype and his athletic profile and how I have him ranked and all that stuff, besides that is Kadarius Toney has his quarterback going substantially behind him in the draft, so where you can provide that natural stack, that natural correlation. And the rest of the Giants pass catchers are also going way later in the draft. Third, and this is going to be into the theoretical components here. On this roster, I already have Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson. So 2 of the top 12-ish quarterbacks on the season. I also have their primary stacking partner in Marquise Brown and Courtland Sutton. But when we're thinking about how this draft is likely to play out, how the field would handle this particular spot where we're at, the field is highly likely to stop at 2 quarterbacks if they already have Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson. Well, I did a study about the Millie Maker winners on DraftKings from 2021, and the findings of that are available to our Best Ball Plus subscribers, but I'll give you a little taste. 4 of the Millie Maker winners, and that's from the regular season, so 4 of the 18 Millie Maker winners consisted of a quarterback stacked with his running back, stacked with a primary pass catcher. What does that mean to us? To me, that means I am not seeing, from the observations that I've made, I am not seeing the field attack best ball in that way. Again, why is that important to us? I have Saquon Barkley and Kadarius Toney on this roster. So if you put those 2 pieces of leverage together on what I'm building here, 1, the field is highly unlikely to take a 3rd quarterback on a roster like this with 2 of the top 12. 2, the field is highly unlikely to build quarterback with a running back with a primary pass catcher. So when we start thinking about how this roster is coming together, high upside in Saquon Barkley, high upside in Kadarius Toney. Well, what would unlock their upside together in this season? It's going to be Mr. Daniel Jones. So that's a very unique perspective that I think the field is not paying attention to this season. All kinds of leverage that we've built into this roster. 1, with the early 2-round picks that we put on this roster in Saquon Barkley and DeAndre Swift. We talked about that. 2, a 3 quarterback build with 2 of them being in the top 12 at the position. We talked about that. 3, a quarterback, running back, wide receiver pairing that we're not seeing the field utilize heavily. So we have 3 layers of leverage that we're planning on this roster, and we're only through We're through 8 rounds. So we have 8 selections on this roster, and I just covered like 3 different layers of leverage that I'm looking to build into this roster that I think the field is not utilizing. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about when I'm going through a draft. I'm not just thinking about like ADP. I'm not just thinking about primary correlations. I'm not just thinking about like value-based drafting. I'm thinking about all of those things together. And then I'm thinking about all this theory stuff that we cover in the Best Ball Plus product over at OWS. Last plug, if you haven't checked that out, it's $1. Head on over to oneweekseason.com. Check it out. You will not be disappointed. I promise you that much. Oh, by the way, if you're not following some of this theory stuff that I'm talking about here, if you are newer to best ball, if you are a DFS player, if you're a season-long player, if you're an ESPN league player, a home league player, but you're looking to get into best ball, the milli on DraftKings is $5. That's a very, very low barrier to entry. It's 150 max. So we're talking about a maximum risk of $750. Let's talk about the prizes. Top prize, $1 million, baby. So you're talking about like the transition from home leagues or from a DFS player or like just a standard season-long player into best ball. This is a very, very good option to jump into that. That said, if all this theory stuff is kind of going over your head, we also have some, I won't call it beginner level stuff, but some entry into best ball level stuff over at 1 Week Season as well. Check all that out. Again, get access to the full package for just $1. So what are we thinking about here? Let's get back to this draft. We currently have 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, and 3 wide receivers with those 3 early quarterback selections. So a guy like Cordero Patterson is a lot less valuable to this roster because of the fact that we already have 3 high floor, weekly floor running backs. What I am looking at, though, is Mr. Zach Ertz here. And what does that do? Builds in some more leverage and theory into this roster. I love it, baby. Let's go. One of the big theory pieces and pieces of leverage that I think the field is not utilizing this year is quarterback pairings with their tight end. Why is that? Or why is that a high upside piece? Well, because tight end position is so reliant on touchdowns to drive their value, particularly for tight ends that fall outside of that top tier that I talked about earlier, because they derive so much of their value from touchdowns, well, who's throwing them their touchdowns? It's their quarterback. So you're double dipping on the potential upside. If a tight end is going to be optimal in week 17, where all the money is made, it is highly likely that they're going to at least have to score 1 touchdown and could have to score 2 touchdowns. So if they're scoring 2 touchdowns, their quarterback is throwing them 2 touchdowns, and that is a high upside pairing here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to mix in some So the decision for me there, I was running out of time, so I wanted to make the pick and then talk about it. The decision there was I probably wanted to go a wide receiver based on how this roster is coming together. That wide receiver decision basically came down to Tyler Boyd and Rondale Moore for me. Those are both wide receivers who are more heavily weighted towards, we'll call it weekly floor wide receivers. However, Rondale Moore, until we see that role change, he was utilized one of the lowest ADOTs, and that's average depth of target, in the league last year. He was seeing a lot of designed usage behind the line of scrimmage, and he's also likely to be that kind of wide receiver 3 and gadgety player on the Cardinals. So the decision came down between Tyler Boyd and Rondale Moore. I think the general field tendencies here with Kyler Murray and Zach Ertz would have been to stack it up with Rondale Moore. But to me, that is a lower upside option than being able to gain access to another top passing offense in the league in Cincinnati Bengals and taking Tyler Boyd. Also, there are some late correlation pieces because Cincinnati plays Buffalo in week 17. That is the hammer game in week 17. It is Monday Night Football. It is the last game of the week. It's also a very expected high-scoring game with a game total currently over 50 points. So gaining access to that with still some correlation pieces that are still left on the board. And, oh, by the way, it's a secondary correlation piece in the sense that it's not a Jamar Chase paired with a primary pass catcher from the Buffalo Bills, like basically Stephon Diggs is impossible. You can't do it. Impossible. You can't pair him with Jamar Chase based on the draft landscape, but it could be like a Davis pairing. So that is primarily where those correlations are going to come from, is those primary correlations. So by gaining access or potentially gaining an under correlated piece of one of the top expected week 17 games, we're getting, again, some more built-in leverage to this roster. Who am I eyeing from Buffalo? Well, I'm eyeing Isaiah McKenzie. I'm potentially eyeing Jamison Crowder. These guys that are going after Tyler Boyd is going off the board. So you see me building up my queue a little bit. I'm going to be building it up basically using the players that we previously discussed. Alberto Aquegbunum, Alberto, as we like to affectionately call him, at OWS, again, gives us that primary correlation or primary stacking partner with a quarterback that we've selected already in Russell Wilson, and probably going to be a lot more or a heavier contributor to the offense with the departure of Tim Patrick. So it also gives us that quarterback and tight end pairing that we talked about earlier. So that is likely where I'm leaning here. Again, Rondale Moore made it back to us, but with how this guy is drafting, I think it is more pertinent. Let me check out his roster now, see if he's got any tight ends. Oh yeah, he took Hawkinson. So I think it's more pertinent for us for how this draft is playing out, and with how did I know dude is drafting behind us, that we might be able to push the envelope and see if Rondale Moore falls to us and take the another member of our primary stack here. Like this is coming together real nice. We got all kinds of layers of leverage built in, and we have some plans to increase that even more here. Yeah, this guy's a loose cannon, man. So this might play out real nice for us to be able to still add on to our primary stack with Arizona. KJ Osborn, let's talk about him real quick. Why do I have him in my queue? Because of the high-powered nature. Oh, he timed out and took Rondale Moore. You bastard. All right, well, Jacoby Myers makes a little less sense for this roster because he's more of a weekly floor type wide receiver. And we are basically embracing the variance and trying to get access to upside. So what we're going to do is we're going to take KJ Osborn here. Might be viewed as a reach, but the reason that KJ Osborn stands out to me on this roster is we have access to Tyler Boyd and KJ Osborn, who are the wide receiver threes, the slot wide receivers for their particular offense. But that being said, Cincinnati, among the league leaders in 11 personnel rate, that means 3 wide receivers on the field at one time. KJ Osborn, with the new coaching staff in Minnesota, McConnell coming over from the Rams last year, they were one of the league leaders in 11 personnel rates as well. So we can expect KJ Osborn to be on the field a lot more this year than last year. And going back to a tried and true rule at 1 week season, always one Viking. If I'm not getting Van Jefferson, Dalvin Cook, or Adam Thielen on a roster, KJ Osborn is kind of my guy. Like, he is going to find his way onto my roster. Through all 150 drafts on Underdog, I had about 91% combined ownership between Dalvin Cook, Van Jefferson, Adam Thielen, and KJ Osborn. So again, back to that like always one Viking rule. That upside of that offense with those playmakers that they have, with the new regime in town, expecting a lot more 11 personnel, expecting less reliance on the between the tackles run game and Dalvin Cook. So I want as much exposure to that offense as I can possibly fit. With KJ Osborn and Tyler Boyd coming onto this roster as the wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 5, they make very natural fits to how we're building and putting this roster together. So let's see here. We are through, we're waiting on our 13th round pick. So this is when the decisions start to come together to form an entire outlook of the, oh my God, I went back again. Let's go. All right, we're back, baby. So this is when we start to piece together these leverage ideas that we've discussed here. What am I eyeing here? I'm eyeing Isaiah McKenzie. I'm eyeing Daniel Jones. That would be basically the best case scenario for this upcoming turn in the constructs of what we've already put onto this roster. Because the fact that we did not get a top 6 tight end on this roster, I am almost always going to err on the side of 3 tight ends. Right now, we have Zach Ertz paired with his quarterback. We have Alberto paired with his quarterback. And we'll talk about some of the tight ends, these later tight end guys that I think have significantly higher upside than where they're being drafted when it gets to that point. Oh no, Daniel Jones and Isaiah McKenzie went. Well, that changes things, huh? What are we going to do now? Let's take a look at the landscape of the draft board, what's available to us. All righty here. Let's take a look at the running back position, make a little personal zig. What am I looking for when I have 3 floor and ceiling, or 3 range of outcomes running backs that are shifted more towards the right, so more towards the upside? Well, I'm looking to take more shots on upside. So a guy like Tyrion Davis-Price makes a lot of sense. A guy like Darrell Williams, who we'll talk about here shortly, I think will make a lot of sense. But at this point, I am kind of hunting for some upside for days. And where I'm going to capture that is here at the tight end position with Hunter Henry. So we talked about, I was trying to wait on some of these tight ends a little bit later, but Hunter Henry is a big-bodied red zone threat. We talked about tight ends deriving so much of their value from getting in the end zone. Well, Hunter Henry is a guy who can do that quite frequently. I think we're going to have to do it. I think we're going to have to leverage the shit out of this and go into that same mindset of quarterback tight end pairings here. And we're going to add Mac Jones to this roster. So what do we have? We have 3 quarterbacks who are all paired with their tight end. And we talked about tight end. An additional layer of the tight end position with respect to leverage is a tendency from the field is to pay less attention to tight end, because the general mantra, the general feeling of the field is, I only have to play 1 tight end. My teachings, my thought process behind that position is, if you shift your mindset to, I have to play 1 tight end every week, you'll start to view the position in a little bit different light, in the sense that, like, it is a more important position than I think the field is giving credit for. So with that, and with this roster that we've built, we're already at 3 quarterbacks. We're already at 3 tight ends through a good chunk of this draft. We're through 14 rounds already, and we've got 3 quarterbacks and 3 tight ends. We have all of them paired with, all tight ends paired with their quarterback. We talked about kind of why that's important to us, from the sense of all the money in these contests is in week 17. So we want to try and do what we can to maximize our upside should we make it to week 17, which is the championship round. On a platform like DraftKings, what does that look like? We're playing against 969 other rosters, or rosters total. So however many teams we make it in, it's 969 rosters total that are making it into week 17. So we still have to win a medium-sized GPP to ship this thing for $1 million. That's why tight end is a little bit more important to me. That's why the correlation or the pairings of tight ends with their quarterbacks is a little bit more important to me. And we just fit all of that onto one roster. Now, what can we do? With 20 rounds, we're allotted a little bit of additional leeway to put 3 tight ends with 3 quarterbacks. Now we can just hammer running backs and wide receivers with high upside players and bring home this roster with our last 6 picks here. So now, looking at the landscape of this draft room, we have a wild card between our 2 picks, and we have an auto drafter before our first pick here at the turn. So again, just keeping an eye on the general landscape of the room and seeing what potential possibilities could exist for us here. So I am not a handcuffer. So Jamal Williams kind of comes out of my decision tree here. I think we're going to go with further access to wide receiver 3s on high-powered offenses here. Van Jefferson is a guy who I could have let slip, or I could have passed on here because he was likelier to slip to my second pick. But really, when we talk about like the landscape of this room, there was really nobody up here who provided higher upside for this particular roster that I would want over Van Jefferson to begin with. Why would Van Jefferson likely to slip? Well, he just had surgery on the knee cleanup procedure. So he is unknown whether he's going to be ready for week 1 or not. All right, so now the decision comes in. Do we want to take a potential upside running back in Darrell Williams, or do we want to take a potential upside wide receiver in Wan'Dale Robinson? Had we secured Daniel Jones, I would highly likely lean towards Wan'Dale Robinson. But since we did not, since we already have 2 players from that offense without their quarterback, we're going to go with Darrell Williams, who is an upside player cuff potentially. Obviously, there are reports out of Arizona that Benjamin is the running back 2. Well, what does that mean to me? That means he is the likelier one to mix in with James Conner in a more Chase Edmonds 2021 role. So is that the highest upside from a backup or the non-starter out of Arizona? Well, I would argue that the higher upside is in the potential injury risk for James Conner. Should that happen, I would expect Darrell Williams to be the guy that takes over the James Conner role. What does that mean? Well, that gives us a Kyler Murray with Marquise Brown, with Darrell Williams, kind of triple stack. And then also we have Zach Ertz in that stack. So that's a team overstack in a way that the field is highly unlikely to do. And that takes us again back to that quarterback, running back, pass catcher stack up that we talked about earlier. But now we're doing it with the backup running back that provides us that potential for late season upside. So here we are. We've got 4 picks left. We're through 16 rounds. We've got our 3 quarterbacks. We've got our 3 tight ends. we have 6 wide receivers and 4 running backs. With the way that this roster itself is particularly built, I would be completely comfortable stopping with Saquon Barkley, DeAndre Swift, Travis Etienne, and Darrell Williams. We'll see if we get access to some of these later guys that also carry additional upside. We'll see if we get access to them, primarily of which is going to be D'Ernest Johnson. If you are not familiar with me or my D'Ernest Johnson love this season, again, check out 1 week season, baby. Check out my Twitter. You find me on Twitter at Hilow, HILOWFF. And you'll find all kinds of D'Ernest Johnson love through those medium. We'll see if we need him. And he gone. So we're at this point, we can take shots on Gus Edwards is probably a floor player. He's likely to not be ready for week 1 to begin with. So he wouldn't be a running back that I would want on this roster. Chris Evans would be, because he provides the direct path to a robust role in Cincinnati. Talked about, Benjamin. We're not going to take both of the backups in Arizona. Hassan Haskins might be one, but right now, really, I am at the point where I'm deciding whether or not I even need another running back on this roster, and I'm more so looking for upside at the wide receiver position to take us home. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring in Kendrick Bourne to this roster because we took Mac Jones, we took Hunter Henry. So we've got a nice little New England stack going on here. Also, why I like that is we can bring it back with a nice little secondary correlation with Miami here in Cedric Wilson. Cedric Wilson, another wide receiver 3 on an offense that we expect to run heavier 11 personnel rates. However, this is a wide receiver that Miami specifically targeted to bring in alongside Tyreek Hill. And oh, by the way, they paid Cedric Wilson $22 million over 3 years. A lot of that is guaranteed. And he is a guy who I expect to be pretty heavily involved in this offense. He is a 5th-year wide receiver without a breakout, but now he's finally getting a role change to where he is one of the primary options on his offense. So this provides us with high upside, with a correlation on our roster, and we have just built all kinds of leverage into this roster. At this point, we talked about the running back position. This is probably going to end up being a 3-4-10-3 build. So pretty comfy with our running back situation. And at this point, we're looking to take as much upside at the wide receiver position to fill out, because it is not that it is the weakness of this roster, but it is probably the position that we have paid the least amount of attention to. And it is one of the higher variance positions in the game of football, in the sense that there are all kinds of wide receivers. One, there's 32 NFL teams. There's typically 2 or 3 starting wide receivers on every roster, whereas a position like tight end, position like quarterback, a position like running back, there are only 1 starter at each of those positions. So we get additional access to hidden upside, we'll call it, at the wide receiver position. And 2, how wide receivers score their points on a full PPR site obviously adds an additional layer of variance for us in the form of spike week potential. So guys, I'm looking at the wide receiver position. When you start getting down to the 19th and 20th rounds, again, DraftKings is a 20-round draft. So when we start getting down to this range, I really am most interested in guys that are either being passed by the field, either going undrafted, or guys that I think can jump multiple rounds in value as the draft season progresses. So who fits that mold? Devin Duvernay in Baltimore, who is currently in a camp battle for the wide receiver 2 role. I would guesstimate that Devin Duvernay is going to win that. There's all kinds of positive press out of camp for James Proche, but James Proche is basically the archetype of a slot wide receiver. But when you think about like the Baltimore Ravens, they do not run a lot of 11 personnel. They run heavy 21 personnel. They run heavy even 12 personnel. So there goes Devin Duvernay. But he's a guy who I expect to be the starting perimeter-ish, because Baltimore doesn't run a standard like wide receiver alignments. But he is a guy who I expect to be the starter opposite Rashad Bateman there. Now we're really getting into it. So there's James Proche. We talked about him. I'm going to throw some OWS specials up here. These are guys who are all going undrafted at the wide receiver position, and they all have their own merits here. Travis Fulgham is an unheralded prospect who obviously made his claim to fame in Philadelphia, where he was thrust into a primary perimeter role through injury, has shown he can produce. He had a 4-game stretch a couple years ago where he went absolutely bonkers, scored like 4 touchdowns, put up like 100-yard games on the reg during that span. But he's a guy who has an outside chance to a perimeter role with Denver because of the injury to Tim Patrick. What we're likely to see to start the season is Cortland Sutton's going to start on one side, Jerry Jeudy's going to start on the other, and KJ Hamler is going to man the slot. Well, why do I like the pick of, or the potential upside of, Travis Fulgham? He is a guy who has multiple paths to playing time because either Jerry Jeudy or KJ Hamler could get injured. KJ Hamler gets injured, it shifts Jerry Jeudy back to the slot, and then Travis Fulgham is likely to man the perimeter. And then if Jerry Jeudy gets hurt, obviously Travis Fulgham could step into that role. Last pick, we're going to end it here with Quez Watkins. Cole Beasley was on the queue, but he is more of a weekly potential floor wide receiver. I wanted to add the upside of Quez Watkins, who is going to be the starting wide receiver 3 for Philadelphia, an offense that we expect to take some steps forward this year. Quez Watkins had 2 games last year. One, he went for 98 yards and scored a touchdown, and the other, he went for like 95 yards and tripped or was tackled at like the 2-yard line. So this is like the premier deep threat for a Philadelphia passing team offense who we expect to take some strides forward. So this roster ended up 3-4-10-3, 3 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 10 wideouts, and 3 tight ends. We got all 3 tight ends paired up with their quarterback. We have 3 layers of primary stacks in New England, in Denver, and in Arizona, all offenses who I think could end the season in the top 12 total offenses in scoring in the league. So we have access to all of them. Sneaking in that New England offense, who is probably one of the more unheralded offenses, passing offenses, that is, in the league, who I expect to place a little bit more onus for games in Mac Jones's hands this year. And then we've got a smattering of high upside wide receiver 3s here. So you see how that came together. You see the thought processes that are going on in my mind throughout that draft. I talked a whole lot about leverage. I think that is very, very important when we're trying to get to a week 17 contest where we're still fighting a total of 969 teams on DraftKings. So when we want that leverage, we want to start bringing in those DFS ideologies, those DFS methodologies to this game of best ball, where I think the field is doing that at a lower rate than they should be. That's how she came together. Again, I am Hilow with 1 Week Season. You're watching 1 Week Season's YouTube channel. Head on over to oneweekseason.com. Check out our DFS stuff. Check out our courses available in the marketplace. Check out our Best Ball Plus available to the masses for $1. That's going to do it. I am Hilow. Find me on Twitter at HilowFF, and we are gone.